And the conclusion of the talk was that you need to understand gross financial flows and the gross financial stocks in the global financial system in order to think in more detail about the policies that are really appropriate to deal with global imbalances. So this was myself and self-contained topic. What I'm going to talk about today is a bit more challenged. And this is the impact of aging on economic policy and how you can deal with that. And the question arises that, first of all, why aging is a problem or why aging is an issue for economic policy and so on. And the second question is why do you want to do anything about it right now? Why don't you want to just wait a little? And the reason why aging is relevant for economic policy, because we set up a number of systems. You can think about healthcare, you can think about pension provision, you can think about the stock market, which depend on the age structure of society. And as soon as it changes, the system will start to change. And the sums involved, the benefits involved in the change are fairly big. So if your country needs to change, if your country needs to face this change at a point in time when everything happens, which can be constrained to 10-year interval, this might overwhelm your pension system, your healthcare system, and so on. We want to prepare for that. The motivation to look at aging is that we see a massive demographic transition going on in most advanced economies and also in most emerging economies. Just to give you a few numbers, in the United States, the proportion of people over the age of 65 compared to those guys who are between 20 and 64. So this is the dependency ratio, the old age dependency ratio, will double over the course of the next 40 years. That means that you will have a lot more pensioners, you will have a lot more people who need healthcare, you will have a lot more people who want to sell their investments compared to those people who pay taxes, who work, who produce GDP, or who buy assets. So this will have a fundamental impact on how society works. And this transition is not limited to advanced economies. Europe is already older than the United States. We'll get much older. Japan is a lot older than the United States. And countries like China will be older than the United States, is measured by median age by 2025. So if you think that America has an aging problem, then China has double that aging problem. So all of this, basically the global economy faces this aging problem. There are only a few regions of the world where you don't see aging issues, and these are unfortunately extremely poor. So this is like sub-Saharan Africa doesn't really have an aging problem. But all economies, all advanced and emerging economies, countries as diverse as Iran, Brazil, or Thailand, most have total fertility rates below replacement level. Which means that these countries, though they are young right now, they will age fairly quickly. And this is not the popular image of these countries. So that's why I'm trying to tell this story. And the demographic transition that we talk about is, there is a very nice S-curve that can describe it, that first population starts to increase and then it levels off and a very strong population growth peters off. But I like more the way how David Willets defined this. David Willets is the minister in the United Kingdom cabinet for education, higher education. And what he said is, and he's pretty sharp, his nickname is Two Brain Willets, and he has a PhD from Oxford. So what the way how we define this is first we stop dying like flies, and then we start reproducing like rabbits. And this is a demographic transition that most countries go through. First you see a massive decrease in the mortality rate. Families first don't react to it. They keep having lots of children, which means that the population is increasing very fast. And after they realize that, oh gee, kids are not dying young anymore, so they stop having these large families, and then family size falls down. In many countries, family size tends to fall down, fall below replacement level. So this is the demographic transition that you see. And once again, and this is a common topic, as we have seen in case of global imbalances, economists tend to be party poopers. They always see the problem, never the good things. In case of global imbalances, essentially you have some globalization going on, which provides immense benefits, but has a few problems that you need to deal with. Now, in case of aging, aging is fundamentally a good sign. It means that we live longer, we live healthier lives, we can work into our 60s. Look at the American presidential election. You got people in the late 60s running for the presidency. We see people working in the late 60s. And it's because we are healthier than what we were 50 years ago, 100 years ago. The only downside is that we set up systems that people retire at age 60. So what we have is we have a massively positive development in the economy. It's just our systems which deal with aging are not really up to that, and we want to think about how to change their systems. So that's the angle how I would like to look at this problem. And the main context is again a positive context. The fact that we are living in an aging world means that we are healthier far longer than any time before in human history. But we have some definite problems that we need to tackle. And I would like to talk about 3 challenges. And I will use 3 papers from the Bank for International Settlements to highlight these problems. The first one is about fiscal. In a way, this is the most straightforward challenge. You see pension provision, you see healthcare provision. If you have a lot more people, they use healthcare more often, so your healthcare budget will go up. Your revenues won't go up. What do you do? The second is real economy. This means that economic growth might slow down. There will be fewer people in the workforce. These people might be relatively older. It seems that people between the age of 25 to 35 start new companies, tend to start new companies. You have fewer of these people, you might have fewer Googles in the future. And it also might have implication for real returns, real long-term returns. Like if you think about transferring your money in time from today, 40 years down the road. I will talk about this one here. And the last one is about the monetary consequences. Usually we assume that aging shouldn't really have monetary consequences because inflation is a monetary phenomenon. The central bank can adjust the money supply, can adjust the interest rate, and can fix any kind of monetary issues, which is true, but it does matter what kind of pressure the central bank sees and faces. So I will talk about this one. So these are the 3 topics to cover. As for the roadmap, there will be four parts of the talk. We already covered the motivation, so that's good. We talk about the real effect, about the fiscal impact of aging and asset prices based on 2 papers, and then on the monetary impact of aging. And this is based on a paper with titled Aging Money Demand and Inflation, and I will conclude with the policy implications. Before getting into the details, I would like to ask you again to ask questions. So this is the way how you can extract value from this course, otherwise you just read the papers and all the papers as far as fluent as I can talk about them. But I think we had a good experience yesterday how to get a little bit deeper and how to probe how good these theories are in dealing with the problems. So I would encourage you to continue asking questions. Whenever in doubt, just ask the question. So let me start with the first issue. And this is about the real effect of aging and the fiscal impact. It's based on a paper done by Sept Takats, who's the economic advisor at the VIS, with two colleagues of mine, so I have no responsibility here. But what they did is that they looked at how public debt is expected to evolve in the future. So they said, let's look at advanced economy fiscal budgets, the major countries, and let's assume that they held in the future all the promises that they made. If they promise pensions, this will be there. If they promise healthcare, this will be kept there, and even the quality of the healthcare will be kept there. If they promise new infrastructure projects, let's keep it in the budget. And let's see what does it imply, how the public debt profile in the future will develop. So in this chart you see on the left-hand side first the main assumption that goes into this paper and goes into our talk actually. And this is the old age dependency ratio. So what these lines will show you, that what is the ratio of people, of old age people, over 65, to working age people. And when I see that there is a massive transition, what you see here is that this ratio was fairly constant up until today in most countries, most advanced countries. So in the chart you see the US, Japan, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Greece for some obvious policy interest. And what you see is that the past 40 years had a little bit of aging. These countries grew a little bit older, but the whole thing is not very dramatic, with the exception of Japan. And what you see around today, that this will change. And this is not some fancy projection. Like we know for a fact, we are here in 2012, but the graph until 2032 is fact. You don't need to project anything. All the guys who are entering the workforce have been born already today. So you know for a fact how this thing evolves. So when it comes to long-term projections, I think you should be very cautious. Long-term projections are kind of science fiction. Who knows what happens next? Who knows what kind of technologies will be there? Usually people don't understand it. They imagine that there were lots of forces in 1950 or the 1900s. No, there's not lots of forces, or Britain will run out of coal because the economy develops and the energy needs will mean that they have to mine out all the coal from under the ground. Or Marcus thought that people will die because population will increase much faster than food production. So long-term projections, the track record is miserable. But the trick here is that you don't need any kind of projections. For these figures until 2032, it's facts. These guys are born. And what you see is that this dramatic increase in the share of old age people. So what you see basically is that Japan is around 20 years ahead of the rest of the pack. And what you could see in Japan, what you see today in Japan might be the issue that there are other advanced economies down the road starting next year. And the question is that what this dramatic increase in the relative number of old people will mean. And on the right-hand side, you see, on this chart, the increase of age-related expenditures as percent of the GDP. So if you just plug in the expenditures which are age-related, so you calculate how much does it cost to put into hospital an average person about the age of 65. Then you look at how many more old people will be there in the population. That's the kind of mechanism that goes through here. And what you see is that in most economies, the budgetary impact is massive. Like it's the largest in Greece, it's very fast, but it's over 5% in Japan or Spain here. It's very large in Germany, which is very fast. And funny enough, it's not that big in Japan, because Japan already solved quite a bit of these problems. Now the problem is that Japan is running a 10% budget deficit compared to its GDP, so the fact that on structural forces they expect to have a 1% deterioration, that's not exactly encouraging. 5 percentage point, that's an awful lot. And this means that these countries need to improve their budget balances 5% just to keep the aging-related expenditures steady. What does this mean? So how we could understand the impact of these things? There's one way to think about this is project the public debt mass. So you look at fiscal debt in the future, and you say that let's assume that countries do nothing. They just keep their promises, they don't change the tax regime. They will grow according to their potential growth, which is fine. And they will just spend more on older people because there are more older people. And this is the path that you get. In Austria, you will end up with 300% of your GDP government debt if you don't change anything. In France, this is 400%. In Germany, this is 300%. Now, the Maastricht criteria is 60%. Countries which have the European average now is around 80%. So this is the rate of growth. There are two other scenarios. One is with small gradual adjustment, this is the middle chart, and with an age-related spending hat constant. That is that you don't spend more on the older population, just distribute evenly. So probably that means lower pensions and a lot lower quality healthcare. And you see that the numbers start to look a little bit better, a lot better in case of Austria, but in case of France, they are still somewhat problematic, do an awful lot better. Let me show you the Anglo-Saxon countries. So, Austria and Germany is aging very fast. Population is exploding. What happens in the United States or the United Kingdom? These are relatively young countries, lots of young people, demography is not that bad. The problem is that in the United Kingdom and the United States, the path is even worse. And the reason is that these countries are relatively young, but they made lots of noises. They have spiraling healthcare costs. So the fact that your demography is basically okay won't help you necessarily if your systems are not designed to deal with the aging problems. So demographic pressure is a lot weaker in the United States, but the promises that the United States made collectively for older people through social security provision are a lot more expensive. And you see that even in the most optimistic case with adjustment and with age-rating spending had constant, the US GDP, debt to GDP ratio increases 200%. 200% is the current Japanese level. That's the world record. And this is kind of a best-looking scenario. So what does this mean? Will we see giant government debt levels in the future? And what it implies is not that. What it implies is that what you see here is an unsustainable process. There are simply promises in the system which cannot be had. The lesson that you should take away from here is not that public debt to GDP will go to 500%. No, it won't. A lot before 500% we will have a debt crisis. So you might start going on this path, but you won't get in 2050 to 500%. And I would quote again Bernstein from the Richard Nixon administration that what is unsustainable will stop. If this process is unsustainable, it will stop. The only question is how. And how you deal with that. And clearly, the kind of healthcare and pension promises that are in the system are unsustainable, but you have to deal with it somehow. And there are several ways how you want to deal, or how you could deal with it. But one obvious way is that you let healthcare provision conditions deteriorate over time. You don't have to rewrite the legislation. You promise healthcare, you provide healthcare, but there are very long wait lists, the quality of that won't go up, the quality won't match with the day standards, so people will opt for private health insurance rather. So that's a pretty ugly way of dealing with aging-related problems, but that's very easy when you corner a government. There is no money, hospitals will get less money and they have to deal with that. There are much nicer ways to deal with the problem. And one is, for instance, we extend retirement age. And the deal is not that bad. We tell people, guys, you live 20 years longer. It really would make sense to work 5 years longer. You will have a lot longer vacation after your working age career is over. And probably the way how society changes and the work that we do changes. You will be able to work a lot longer. If you do heavy-duty agricultural work, probably you want to retire at age 60 or 65 because your productivity is declining. If you work in an office, I think age 65 is much less of an obstacle. And the age 70 is possible. So there are several plans to link retirement age to life expectancy in an automatic fashion. Some people live longer, they would automatically retire a little bit later. And one more idea that people usually float is that you can just ask people to take care of themselves. If you want to retire at age 65, fine, but you should stay. You invest in the stock market or in bond market, but whatever, you invest in a pre-funded private pension fund. And you are not reliant on the government. Yes?
I don't really see what is included in these increase of government-related expenditure, since in some countries like the UK, the healthcare system is funded by, from the budget, but in others we have a public insurance system which does not affect the government budget and expenditure at all, and might even incur profits.
Mm-hmm. Which country do you have in mind?
For instance, Germany and Austria. And they have presently, in the last 2 years, incurred even profits from the public pension funds.
All right, so
why are the numbers so similar if the structure is so different?
The basic problem with healthcare provision is that you incur the cost. The cost of the total healthcare cost that anybody incurs will be in your last year of your life. It's not that you know when your last year of your life happens, but this is when you get in the hospital, people try lots of expensive treatments, they fail and you die. And before that they try lots of expensive treatment, they succeed, you stay alive, but the last time is the trickiest. And that's the time when lots of people are running out of private health insurance. So you're running a government health insurance system which relies on payments from essentially working class people. And all the expenditures are concentrated in a small number of older people. Now the problem is that if the small number of older people increases massively, and the number of people who are paying into the system doesn't increase that massively, then you have a gap. This is the basic intuition. In the United States, you have private healthcare provision for most working age people. Like unless you're extremely poor. If you're extremely poor, then the government provides you with health insurance. But if you have the means, then you have to pay for your own health insurance. In old age over 65, this is when health insurance becomes really expensive. The government will start to pay through Medicare. And then again, in the United States, the biggest problem is losing your health insurance at the age of 60. Because this is the time when you start to grow old, problems can appear, but if the government doesn't yet pick up the tab. And this is the time it's very difficult to find health insurance for yourself. That's the tricky part of the market. So going back to your question, the basic problem is very similar in the sense that society has to pay out real expenses for older people, And the number of days people who will need these services will increase massively. And whatever is the structure you have to fund this, or you are not able to fulfill your promises. So that's the basic story.
I'm sorry, just not sure. Is the healthcare system or the pension system, does the healthcare system or the pension system have a bigger fiscal impact actually?
It's 90% for the healthcare in the United States. So healthcare system is an order of magnitude more expensive than the pension system. So it's 10 times. Now the healthcare in the United States is very expensive. So precise numbers can vary across countries, but usually healthcare is the big ticket. And actually that's why you would want to think a lot about these questions, because healthcare, you can control costs by decreasing quality. It's very easy to set up a very long waiting list. It's very easy to constrain supply of healthcare services. So pension is the more easily resolved problem, but we would tend to think more about pensions. But getting back to this question, can you use private pension provision? So many people looked at this pay-as-you-go systems and figured out that pay-as-you-go systems work in most of our countries, in most of the countries in the region. What you see is that the number of people who work pays into the system, and pensioners receive pensions from these payments. So there is no fund, there is a very little relationship between how much did you contribute and how much you are receiving. And these pay-as-you-go systems will face an obvious problem. So the ratio of those guys who receive pensions compared to those guys who pay into the system will explode in the past 40 years. So pay-as-you-go system just won't be able to deliver the same kind of pensions that they are able to deliver today. There is the idea that instead of doing this pay-as-you-go system, we invest in the stock market or in the bond market. And this is the topic of the next discussion. This is based on a paper that I wrote 2 years ago, and titled Aging and Asset Prices. It was proudly featured in the Economics Focus one-pager. And the basic idea that I propose there is that aging can affect asset prices. Like imagine that everybody is trying to secure pensions privately. Like we live a life cycle, we are born, we work, and then we retire. So when we work, we save. We invest in some kind of assets. When we retire, we sell the assets, take the money, and buy goods to consume. So what we are doing is that we are not using the government to legislate pensions. We are using some kind of asset to sell for the new guys, for the new young people, to care for our old age pensions. Now, what is the problem here if you have a demographic transition? You have a baby boom, lots of people. All of us want to save. All of us want to save for old age. What does it mean? That there's an extremely large demand for assets. We drive up asset prices. Everybody wants to buy assets. Everybody wants to save. And when we grow old, the baby boomers grow old. There's a huge generation which want to sell assets. There's a very small generation, the next one, which wants to buy assets. You have a lot more sellers than buyers. That's good for, that's not exactly good for asset prices. So the basic idea is that you can get into a very similar problem to asset prices. Let me walk through the mechanics how it can exactly work. I try to give the intuition, but it can be complicated. Did you work with life cycle models? Have you seen life cycle models in economics? Okay. Yeah, so life cycle consumption. So the life cycle model tells you that baby boomers could affect asset prices. So let me show you a few graphs. Here what you see, excellent real yield. So I look at the 10-year government bond yields, treasury yields from the United States. I look at 10-year expected rate of inflation. And I look at the ex-ante real yield, which means that this is the real yield that people expect when they buy the treasuries. So this was close to 5% in the 1980s, which sometimes 7%. You should have bought them because it went steadily down over the course of the next 30 years. So in 2010, this was down to 2%. I didn't update this chart because central bank policies, the quantitative easing massively distorts this picture since 2010. Do you guess what is the expected real yield for a 10-year treasury now? So what is the real return that you expect today when you buy a 10-year treasury bond?
6%.
No. It's negative. So today people are ready to give up consumption. Say, government, you can have more money 10 years from now. And in real terms, I ask less back. Actually, up until 15 years, inflation protected bonds have 0 yield, which means that you get back your investment plus the rate of inflation, but no more return than that. So this decline is accelerated and often. Also look at equity price to earnings ratios. And what you see is that price to earnings ratios, this is the United States S&P 500, were around 10 in the early 1980s. And then increased massively. This is the dot-com bubble with over 40. And they declined somewhat to around 25-ish before the financial crisis. And even in the middle of financial crisis, it was around 15. So this is the Case-Shiller cyclically adjusted P ratio as well. What you see is that even in the middle of the financial crisis, which looks like a great buying opportunity, equity prices were priced around 50% more expensive than what was the norm during the early 1980s. And after the financial crisis, it reverted back roughly to double the valuation. And we are still at 20. And real house prices, this is also US data from the Case-Shiller index. You see a massive increase, though you had two little bubbles, two big cycles. This is in the early 1990s, and the deceleration of that cycle meant the savings and loan crisis. And this super cycle up here, this was the financial crisis. And actually, I started to talk about this project here around 2006. I lived in Washington, D.C. With a bunch of friends, we looked for houses. Do you want to buy a house or not? And what was really amazing that all the houses that we went to see, if the owner was there, the owner probably told me that I couldn't afford this house today. The only way I could afford the next house that I'm moving into is to sell this one and cash in the capital gains. So basically, everybody was living in a house that they couldn't afford. The only way that they could afford is that they were already seeing something which took part of this uptick here. And our conclusion was, so there was an active discussion obviously with friends that whether you want to buy a house or not. We decided no, we don't buy a house, for which I'm very grateful. But then we look at other assets. Okay, how the stock market is behaving, how the bond market is behaving. And everything seemed to be expensive. And why are these assets so much more expensive today than they were 20 years ago? And the answer is that I'm trying to tell you now is that aging and the baby boomers are responsible for that. So what happened that in the past 30 years, baby boomers started to buy assets, and this asset purchase has increased prices, asset prices, massively. Now, the problem with this one is that these baby boomers will retire. They actually started to retire this year, and they will start to sell these assets, which will put a downward pressure on all these asset prices. Let us see how it goes. So the results basically tell you that aging will affect and will affect house prices, asset prices, which means that it will affect private savings and it will affect private pension provision. In a sense, you can't escape the consequences of aging through some financial engineering. And I use house prices to identify this impact, and what I sense is that as economic house prices will face headwinds. And if you turn these results from advanced economies to the global financial data, you see that asset prices face headwinds of around 1 percentage point. per annum over the next 40 years. It's nothing catastrophic, but there's quite a bit of headwind, which means that if you are trying to invest today, you shouldn't really look at the past asset returns. Past asset returns are really misleading, can be misleading indicators. You have a very different demand picture in the past 40 years and the next 40 years. And the only question is that, all right, so you have this idea, and this comes back to how you want to think about economics. You have this broad idea that there will be the baby boomers, lots of people buying assets, and all asset prices went up. But how do you identify this impact? And this is an economics question. If you look at the United States, you have one baby boom generation and one asset price cycle. All right, maybe two asset price cycles in 40 years. You can't really identify anything based on that data. So what I will try to do is that I look house prices from 22 advanced economies to identify the impact. And what you have is that the aging profile is very different in these 22 advanced economies. I include also Korea, Japan. And the variation in the aging profile and the variation in house prices helps you to tease out the impact of aging. And why is that so important? The first person to think about this issue was Greg Mankiw. And the Greg Mankiw and Wine had a paper in 1989 when they projected a massive house price decline in the United States. But they only used US data. And what was the problem with that one? That you can't really identify things. So the next set of guys, this is Engelhardt and whatever. They said, all right, so let's suppose you're right. Let them take your model to Canada. Canada is not that much different from the United States. If there's a life cycle in the US, there should be a life cycle in Canada too. They ran the regression data on Canada. The effect was not there. So what they said is that in the US, you probably just misidentified the whole issue. So that's why you need an international sample. Lots of people use international financial assets, but that's also not problem-free. And this is an idea how you try to tease out the economic effect of something. With international financial assets, the problem is that you know you live in a country which is aging. Let's suppose that the theory is right. Life cycle prices and prices. You live in a country which is aging fast, which means that future asset returns are very bad. Supposed to be very bad. What do? You go and buy a mutual fund which invests abroad. It's very simple. Cross-border investment in financial assets is a lot easier than in real assets. So in financial assets, you might not be able to identify the impact of aging because there is capital liquidity. So that's the reason to look at house prices and an international comparison of house prices, because it's an awful lot more difficult to buy houses abroad. A lot of legal restrictions and lack of mutual funds, which will stop you to do that. And houses are very chunky. You don't necessarily want to buy a house in 7 countries, so most people just can't. All right, so this is how the theory looks like. Did you work with overlapping generation models? So let me walk through the very basis of how an overlapping generation model works. In standard macroeconomics, you have a representative agent. There's one guy who lives forever. And this guy has a discount rate, and you assume that this discount rate has to do something with that some people are just dying in society. Now, in an overlapping generation model, you always have agents who have a finite life. You know which agent stays around. In this example, they live for 2 periods. In one period they work, the other period they consume what they have in retirement. Then they maximize utility. They have some utility when they are young, and they have some utility when they are old. So in that sense, they are very standard agents. And the overlapping means that when one generation of them is young, another generation is already old in this society. So in the economic model, you always have some people who are young, some people who are old. Now, if there is no demographic transition, then you actually have no reason to use this life cycle model. It gives you exactly the same results as a standard representative agent model. But as soon as you start to have some shifts in the number of the young and the old, they will start to interact in a non-standard way, and this affects the way how you think about. Just as an aside, and this is something that you might want to work out if you are interested in this kind of models. The representative agent models and life cycle models give you sharply different predictions for current account deficits. So if you think back of our lecture yesterday, that we have seen current account surpluses in China. And based on a representative agent model, that's nonsense. Like if you are in a fast-growing economy, it means that in the future you are much richer than today. Basically, all utility maximization will tell you that you want to smooth consumption. So if you know that you are rich tomorrow, 20 years down the road, you want to consume an awful lot more today. Which means that as a country which is developing fast, growing very fast, should run a current account deficit. I think this logic is fairly easy. Now if you think about the life cycle model, the mechanism of the life cycle model will tell you exactly the opposite. It means that the guys who are consuming today, they want to save. The guys who are spending money are the old. The old were very poor when they were working, so they don't have too much money to spend. The guys today are richer, and these are the guys who are saving, and they have an awful lot more money. Which means that savings are higher than investments. Savings are higher than consumption in this model, which means that the country should run a current account surplus. I think this is one way to think about economic modeling and which one is relevant. And that tells an awful lot about how uncertain is our conclusion about what is an equilibrium path for an economy. If it's not clear, you can work it out very quickly with this life cycle model and encourage you to do it. So the reason to use overlapping generation models in the life cycle is often to have a different angle how the economy works. All right, you have a standard resource constraint that you have some income which you can consume, invest into the future at some interest rate. And this R interest rate in this model will be endogenously determined. There is no band here. Nobody will tell you that this is the interest rate that you are receiving. But you really will go on the market today, you buy some of the asset, and when you retire, you go again on the market and try to sell this asset and see how much you can get for that. And we have some economic growth, GT, and some demographic growth, DT, in the model. So the economic growth and also population can grow or decline. That is vary from the derivation of the model, but let me tell you just how the basic look like. So what is the equilibrium rate of return on this asset that we have in the model? This depends on economic growth and demographic growth. So what happens basically that each generation has some saving needs. The richer the next generation is, the higher the saving needs of that generation is. The more people the next generation has, the higher the saving needs are. And these are driving asset prices. So the model tells you that asset price growth is driven by economic factors and demographic factors. So if you think in terms of the key ratio, price to earnings ratio of activities, the economic growth factor is the earnings. It's already. So what the demographic factor will drive is the price to earnings ratio, what we looked at in the previous chart. Alright, so this was theory, this was an extremely stylized model, how you can translate this to reality. And what I do is I look at economic growth is like real GDP per capita growth. Straightforward. And for demographics, what you are interested in is the equilibrium of buyers and sellers. And there are two potential empirical measures for that. One is the old age dependence ratio. This is what we have seen in the case of the previous paper. This is the ratio of the old to working age. Working age people save assets, old age people sell them. And total population. This captures demographic change, even unchanged population structure. In the model, the two are the same. In practice, they are not the same. So I would use both. And in the empirical analysis, I would use an international sample of house prices, 22 economies, real estate data from the Bank for International Settlements over for 40 years. And as you see, so in theory, real economic growth will be captured by GDP per capita, and demographic will be captured by old age dependency ratio and total population. Now, there are many studies of house prices, especially now, but even 4 or 5 years earlier, there were lots of them. And this one is different in its aim. Like most house price studies, the ones that we did at the IMF, for instance, were focused on, is the housing market in equilibrium? Is there any kind of problem with the house pricing? Is there a bubble on the market? And that's a very different question when you try to figure out what is the equilibrium house price. Here I don't care with that. I don't care with bubbles. All what I care about is trying to figure out the marginal impact of demographic change. So this model that I have won't be able to tell you whether house prices are over or undervalued. All it wants to tease out of the data is that what is the marginal contribution of the old age dependency ratio, what is the marginal contribution of total population, to understand the long run asset price drivers. And short run, I don't care. So that's something not a standard way to think about it. And this is the house price data set. So as I told you, when you do empirical analysis, you need to get some kind of variation in the data. If you have only 2 data, one goes up, the other goes down, you have negative correlation, but it's very meaningless. This can be spurious correlation. If you have enough data, you can establish correlation between weird things. Like, number of stars seen on the night sky should correlate with some kind of stock exchange measure. If you dig long enough, you will find it. But here, you should see that there is some kind of variation in the house price models, and I would argue that there is quite a bit. So here you see the countries in the center of Europe: Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Netherlands, and Switzerland. And lots of these countries have had very strong real price gains over this period, but not all of them. And Germany is the slowest one here. German house prices start to pick up right now, but they are still below the 1970s level. Switzerland is roughly here after some bubble. So, and these are the faster aging countries. So by and large, what you see is not entirely unreasonable, but this is quite far from being a proof. Also, these are the countries in the south and in the periphery of Europe, also sometimes seen as the countries in trouble. Greece, Italy, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. And you see that some of these countries have experienced a massive house price boom, but not all of them. And here we have a counterexample for demography. This is Italy. And Italy has a very fast aging population, but it has massive house price gains. So this is one point against the theory. And these are the northern European countries. But I would like to highlight that the scale is different here. They had a very big house price gains. The biggest one was in the United Kingdom. This is the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom is a relatively young, but not the youngest ever country. And actually, there is some pretty good analysis which shows that what you see in Britain is simply constrained supply at work. So countries can have very different price levels. If you don't let people to build new houses and number of people increasing who wants to buy houses, they will build up the prices. And by and large, this is the London story. The house price increases are not justified based on income, not justified based on economic gains, but they are justified based on constrained supply. But this just highlights how difficult it can be to capture house price gains. And here you see the non-European countries of our sample, and probably the most interesting most well-known one is the case of the United States, which had this big up and down that we have already seen, and also Japan. So Japan get back to where it was in the 1970s in terms of real house prices. So Tokyo is affordable today. That's the good news. But you see that house prices went up, and as society started to age, and I mentioned that Japan is roughly 20 years ahead of everybody else in terms of aging. And what is interesting to see that they had this big run-up of house prices, roughly 20 years ahead of everybody else had a big run-up of house prices. So Japan peaked in 1991. Europe and the United States peaked in 2006, 2007. I'm not saying that there's a causality, but I would think that there is something interesting there. There is such a close parallel. And I would actually think that if you want to think about global economic policy, probably studying and understanding what happened in Japan and what is the relevance of the Japanese story to other countries would be a relevant direction. Just based on this very simple grounds. So what you see here is there's an awful lot of heterogeneity across countries. Those countries which age faster, as are the Germany, Switzerland, Japans of the world, tend not to have very strong price gains. Those countries which are relatively young had a young population, like the United States, Australia, had a strong house price gain. This is no proof, but this tells you, just looking at the chart, that there might be something interesting. So let's do regression analysis. Let's try to tease out these factors. And what you see, this regression is run on yearly data. PR squared is kind of decent for a panel data, 0.3, that's good. And what you see is that real GDP per capita, the 1 percentage point higher real GDP per capita implies a 1 percentage point higher real house prices. People are richer, houses are more expensive, fair enough. These two guys are the more interesting ones. What is the old age dependency ratio? Which means that if you increase the old age dependency ratio by 1 percentage point, this is the regression of running logs, then this decreases house prices, everything else kind of constant by 2/3%. Countries which have more people tend to have lower house prices. And total population, if there are more people, they have the prices more of housing. Roughly 1% more total population of a country is correlated with 1 percentage point higher real house prices in that country. So based on this guy, this suppression, house demography affects house prices significantly, at least statistically significantly. I'm not getting into the econometric details of what kind of fixed effects we use. You can read it. But I think here this is the case that once you have this holistic kind of graphs to look at robustness, quite a bit of the house price changes were concentrated in the second half of 2010. So you want to see whether this relationship remains robust with the crisis or without the crisis. For instance, already got the variables. It might be that it's only interest rates driving house prices. All the coincidence with all the correlation with demography is a pure coincidence. So let me just go through this kind of models here. The first model shows that if you don't control for demography, then real GDP still affects house prices. The first three models tells you that the model is fairly robust. These variables look orthogonal to one another. This was the benchmark model, this is what we have already seen. M4 is the model if I had long-run interest rates. And you see that nothing really changes. M5 is the model if I had short-run interest rates. And short-run interest rates, these things explain what happens with house prices. So you see that the R-squared is increasing. So the richer model explains you what happens, but it doesn't kill the marginal impact of demography. So this is exactly what you want to see in a model. And then there are some constraints in M7, M8, and M9 of the period that I consider, and the result seems to be robust. The exact magnitudes here can change. So probably I shouldn't and I don't put a lot of emphasis on the point estimates. The point is that demography has strong negative impact. There can be some variation how big this impact is. And but this is something that you want to do in such a research. You want to run. I ran this regression excluding countries one by one. So once you have the database, this is not a big deal. You sit down and then you use take a MATLAB, whatever you are using to exclude one country. But you are on a much surer footing that it's not one outlier driving the results. It's just kind of misleading. So what I said is that the effects that we see here are statistically significant. But the real question is not statistical significance. You don't really care in economic policy about statistical significance. It doesn't matter much. You can have something statistically significant and economically zero impact. It's good for publishing, but for economic policy, it's not impressive. So what I do here is to translate the impact from the model to the countries in the sample. So I take the model coefficients, I take the real historical variables between 1970 and 2010, and then the future forecasted ones between 2010 and 2050 from the United Nations population projections, combine them and look at the projected demographic impact based on this model. So what you see is that the red columns tell you the history of demographic impact. So how much demography contributed to house prices over these 40 years. And the red line tells you what was the average. And on average, and this is basis points per year. So on average, demography in advanced economies contributed to around 40 basis points each year to house price growth, real house price growth, over the next 40 years. And these averages varied a lot between different countries. The demographic impact was hugely positive in Ireland. It was pretty big in the United States and Australia. But it was already fairly negative in Japan, where the drag was around 100 basis points. Germany and Italy and Finland. But overall, the past 40 years were the time of the baby boom. In most economies, house prices went up, and demography took a role in that, took a part in that. In the next slide, I will show you how much of that part was. But the trick here is that the future is dramatically different. So if this model is right, then no countries, all right, except for Australia, which had close to zero impact, almost no country will have a positive demographic impact. And all countries will face declining house price due to demographic factors. Like other factors can compensate for this one. And the average impact, this is the blue line down here, is roughly as negative as what Japan has seen. So if you think that the Japanese real estate market is in a sorry state, this model suggests that advanced economy average will be where the Japanese average is right now in terms of history. So that's not exactly encouraging. This tells you that the demographic impact, the switch from a plus 40 basis points to a negative 60, 70 basis points, there is roughly 100 basis points drop here. So what you had before is that you had lots of young, eager people entering the market, buying stuff, buying houses here, and that drove up prices. In the future, these guys will quit. They will try to sell these houses, and this will, relatively speaking, driving down the house prices. So house price growth in the future can be like 100 basis points slower over the future 40 years than over the course of the last 40 years. And 100 basis points is a lot. So this is 100 basis points each year accumulated over 40 years. These are non-zero, these are economically significant effects. But I promise you some decomposition. So here what you see is the black lines tells you the historic house price change. The red columns tell you the demographic impact, and these beige, yellow colored columns tell you the historic economic impact. So what you should take away from this chart is that you see a big variation in house price gains over 40 years. And probably economy is a more significant contributor to house prices. So if you want to buy houses, economic prospects tend to be more important than demographic ones. So faster growth is probably more important than the aging profile of a country. And it also means that by no means these factors mean destiny. So there are lots of country-specific factors. My favorite example is Italy. Italy had a negative demographic impact. One of the countries, they have actually the number 3, the third strongest negative impact of all countries. And it had the third strongest house price gains over the same period. Like one reason is the Italian strong growth, especially in the 1970s. And other country-specific factors, mainly supply factors. The same of Britain. Demography had a 0 contribution. Economy had a slightly positive contribution, and Britain had the largest house price gains. So, in this sense, demography is not destiny, but you see, so a negative demographic coefficient doesn't mean necessarily bad news, but what you see is that there is still a correlation here. So, what are the problems, potential problems? How can, if you want to use this for economic policy, you have massive heterogeneity across countries, so that's one problem. Second, I don't control for housing supply changes. Some countries have very limited supply. The United Kingdom. Other countries let supply grow when people want to buy. Germany let supply grow. This creates an awful lot of variation in terms of how much demand translates into prices. Also, the link between demography and house prices is not necessarily as straightforward as I try to tell you. If more people, in the 1970s, more people lived in families. Today, more people own a house or own an apartment at least as a single individual. This means that even though there are less people, housing demand might be higher. Because the need for housing can change. And as far as projections are concerned, as I said, long-run projections are kind of tricky. The next 20 year projection we know for a fact. Because everybody is born, will enter the working force over the course of the next 20 years. If there is no major war, there is no big natural catastrophe, these people will survive. But what happens after the next 40 years is anybody's guess. So even the projections are different. And I think that there are 2 big risks to these kind of projections. Let me talk about the upside. One upside is that, and as we have seen in the previous talk, it's really unlikely that society would work the same way 40 years down the road how it works right now. Simply because we have lots of unsustainable processes. So we will see some kind of changes. And there is one upside here from the social changes which are in the book somehow. That we might end up redefining old age. And there is a movement to increase retirement age, most effective retirement age, and legal retirement age. In many countries, people retire much earlier than the legal retirement age. If this happens, the mother's conclusions get weakened. The house price pressure will get weakened because simply enough more people will continue to work, people will start to sell their assets a lot later. So that's one difference. But there is also a downside effect. Let's assume that economic policymakers react to aging problems by cutting pension benefits. Say that, all right, we made these promises, but we wake up and we actually can't pay these pensions. This is already happening in the United States. Many municipalities promised pensions that they are not able to pay. San Diego went bankrupt. Many firms go bankrupt. General Motors renegotiated its mortgage promises. An awful lot of other municipalities are in deep trouble on pensions. So you don't have to have the national pension system to default to have a massive renegotiation of pensions. If that happens, that means that the pressure on oil people will be a lot stronger to sell houses, to sell assets that they have to maintain living standards. So that could make the model work even stronger than what you saw here. And let me just give you two quotes. This is about aging projections. First is Schumpeter, and the second one is Keynes. So what Schumpeter said, I'm not sure whether you read, so you're reading is the Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy as a book. I would suggest reading at least the part on capitalism. It's entertaining. So what Schumpeter said in 1943 is that forecasts of future populations from those of the 17th century on were practically always wrong. He was right in that. Population forecasts are miserable. Ever since Marcus, people had it wrong. Interesting thing is that this is what Schumpeter says, and next he projects. So what he says that falling birth rate seems to me to be one of the most significant features of our time. And Keynes in 1937 has a famous lecture called Some Economic Consequences of a Declining Population. Now what is remarkable about this famous big economist in 1943 and 1937, that when they projected falling population, it was really a few years, 5-6 years before the baby boom started. So they were totally wrong. And I think that this is something that should caution us too. That we see some kind of demographic trends, but it's not, the world is not linear. It doesn't work in a linear fashion. And I think it can surprise us. And this actually highlights one of the major problems of economic policy making. Because one thing should be clear from the discussion here, that what we face is a massive change by all likelihood. So if old age dependency ratios double in all these countries, that will strain pension provision, healthcare provision, that can be a huge problem for asset prices and pre-funded pension systems that I showed here. On the other hand, it might be that this trend doesn't go on as projected. So for policymakers, there's a big trade-off. You don't necessarily want to act, and you don't necessarily want to act on a trend that you don't fully understand. So that's I think, a tricky position. All right. So we already talked about the asset price implications. But if you translate this model, the model coefficients to global asset prices, which is kind of a big leap, and you take into consideration that the old age dependency ratio will double by 2050, then you see around that 1 percentage point, the 100 basis point headwind for global asset prices. This is not huge. Asset price growth is in the range of real terms of 3-4%. Shave of 1% is still 2 to 3. It doesn't mean that you should stop having stocks or bonds or not invest your money at all. But it means that the returns can be dramatically lower than what they were before. Let me just skip this one and move a bit forward further. All right, so let's discuss the policy implications. So one very straightforward implication here is that private pre-funded pension provision faces similar challenges than pay-as-you-go systems. Pay-as-you-go systems will have a problem because there are less working age contributors and more old age pensioners. Private pre-funded pension systems will face problems because there are less working age buyers of assets and more old age seller of assets, which pushes down asset prices and pushes down the stuff that they can pay pensions for. And this is not a surprise if you think about it. Your essential problem is that you want to transfer wealth from today 40 years down the road. And there is no such thing as intrinsically valuable. You can't dig food into the ground, canned food. You can't dig a car in the ground and pick it up 40 years down the road. You have to somehow convince the people who are working 40 years down the road to give the proceeds of their work to you, something. And one way to convince them is to have a legal system set up and call it public pensions, and tell the working age people that, guys, the deal is that you are contributing to the pension system, you are receiving the pensions, but when you grow old, you will receive pensions from the next set of practice. Sounds like a Ponzi scheme, something like that. Or you can say, let's have a pension fund, we change assets, we call it equity bond house, but it can be only money. It doesn't mean how you call it. There is some asset that you exchange, and the young people need to buy this asset to be able to sell it when they grow old and consume, and the old people need to sell it when they are young. The trick is that these two mechanisms are very similar. You exchange some kind of promise. Whether the promise is a legal promise, or whether the promise is an asset, is only a technical difference. Technical difference, that will be practical conclusions, but essentially what you are doing is not that much different. Today you are trying to solve a problem of how to transfer consumption for people who won't work, surely won't work 40 years down the road. And what is the institutional framework you do? It shouldn't react to the main problem. So in a sense, what you saw here as a result, that private pre-funded pensions can come under strains, is not that surprising. Actually, if somebody would tell you that pre-funded pensions should be fine, you should start to get worried. Okay, what are your assumptions? How can you make yourself independent from this massive real change? So there will be relatively less people producing the goods. There will be lots of people who want to consume these goods. How can you deal with this change? So I think this is not that surprising once you think into it. And this can have consequences for financial stability. Obviously, you are interested in asset prices for financial stability. If asset prices decline, that's usually not good for financial stability because you have an awful lot of loans, mortgages, or other kind of loans behind these assets in the financial system. So this can affect collateral values. And also it can affect their sustainability. Because if this analysis is right, then what you see today is extremely low long-run interest rates that help you finance very large government debts can just disappear in the future, and you can see an increasing rate of real returns. So what we see in the first slide, this decline in the long run, ex ante year, this can reverse. This theory says that this will reverse. Because you have to spend an awful lot of money to finance the government budget deficit. Okay, just a question. Do you have questions on this one? How aging affects asset prices? All right, so we have done two things so far, and we have enough time for thing number 3. The first one was that aging affects fiscal costs, healthcare costs, and pension costs. And these costs are huge once you put your fingers on it and try to quantify it. Now the second piece meant that aging does affect asset price returns. That's also a real story. There is no money here. And it said that you can't really separate yourself from these aging problems through the stock market. The stock market will go through very similar tensions because of aging as government finances. So there is a limited room of freeing yourself from aging-related pressures globally. Now this doesn't mean that you cannot free yourself from aging pressures locally, especially if you are a small country. If you are a small, very fast aging country, your public pension provision looks in a horrible shape. You can internationally diversify assets. This is like Chile internationally diversifies its pension assets. It's not a very fast aging country at all. For them, the pension provision depends more on global factors than local factors, so you can do that. But given that we know that the world as a whole will double the old age dependency ratio, there are limits how much you can get away from this. Like as a small country, you can get the global average, but as a whole world, you can't escape the impact of aging through the financial markets. So this is one of those risks that you can't diversify because it's in the global system. Now, there is one question left, and this is what I usually get. Right? I'm trying to ask this one: that okay, what should we invest money in then? Asset prices look very bad, so should we have a nice vacation and forget about the investment? Pension everything looks horrible, so let's just forget about it, or should invest in money? What happens with inflation? And I think this is the logical next question. What does this aging mean for inflation? And this is not an academic question. If you look at several countries have massive investments in real assets, compare, for instance, Germany or Italy and Italy. Germany and Italy are both rich countries. The typical Italian household has lots of real assets. They have a nice house in Rome and a villa on the beach. Some nice paintings on the wall. So this is the stereotypical picture, but there's truth in that. The typical German household does have lots of financial assets. They have life insurance policies, they have savings in government, bonds, or in bank deposits. So it really does make a big difference when inflation hits one country or the other. If you have lots of nominal assets, you can lose your life savings with very high inflation. If you have real assets, you don't really care. Your house will be a house, your painting will be a painting. It doesn't matter how you change the price of bread. You don't really care. So here the next question that I will try to answer is that what does this aging imply for inflation and inflationary pressures? Because we would want to understand, can we avoid the aging pressures through money holding? And this is based on a paper jointly with Kiyoko Nishimura. Now, Nishimura is in his free time the deputy governor of the Bank of Japan. So he's a fairly senior policymaker. And they are obviously interested in what is the impact of aging. Japan has a very low inflation right now, very high government debt, and a very fast aging population. And there is lots of nominal values in the economy. So it's not entirely uninteresting what happens with inflation in such a setup. So what we do with them is we insert money into the model. So we allow these overlapping generation agents with a life cycle to invest not only in housing or property, but also in nominal money. So there is some nominal stock of money, and then they can insert that. And what is the price of money? The price of money is the inverse price level of the group that they have. I will. I'm kind of running out of time, so let me just tell you the results very quickly. What we find is that aging does affect the Marshallian K. The Marshallian K is the ratio of money to GDP. And based on standard economic theory, you couldn't expect any kind of impact. The Marshallian K should depend on inflation, interest rates, maybe real interest rates. But this is something that shouldn't depend on the age structure of the population. What our model tells that aging should affect the Marshallian K. When there are lots of young people, they try to have assets, try to hold assets, including money. So when the baby boomers enter, the money supply can increase without inflationary consequences. And the other consequence is that when the baby boomers exit and they grow old, they want to reduce their money holdings to consume. And when they reduce their money holdings, this decreases the marginal ANK. And the second consequence of that is that the baby boom was deflationary. There were lots of people who produced goods but didn't really want to consume these goods because they wanted to save. Especially when the baby boomers were between 40 and 64. So in a sense it was much easier to control inflation when the baby boomers were middle-aged. The problem is that when they retire, it will be a lot more difficult to control inflation. So what we say is that there's an inflationary impact of aging here. And one nice corollary of the model is that monetary stability. If there is a central bank in the model and it tries to stabilize the price of money, the inverse of the price level, you do some kind of inflation targeting, that actually smooths not only the price level but also the house price level. So monetary stability is good for property price stability. So the kind of demographic transition that we have in mind is a standard baby boom. You get lots of young people born at some point unexpectedly. Like you saw that neither Keynes nor Schumpeter expected the baby boom, so I think it's a decent assumption that even in a rational expectation model, a baby boom is something that people didn't expect. And then the population sizes the baby bust, the baby boomers didn't have that many children themselves, and this is the aging phase of society, and then the system goes back to a new steady state. You have to solve different equations which are entirely not interesting from a policy perspective, so I will skip those things. And I will just keep going through the solutions. We have two models. In one, there is a fixed money supply, but I would like you to understand the logic, because logic is once again departing from standard logic in some important ways. So under fixed money supply, you fix the amount of money circulating in the economy and let the price level adjust. This is like the gold standard. And the interesting thing under the gold standard case is that economic growth is deflationary. Usually we associate economic growth with inflation. Faster the growth is faster inflation. If you want to control inflation, you slow down economic growth. This is only true with flexible money. If you have fixed amount of money, the faster the economic growth is, the relative price of money is increasing and the price level is dropping. People want to hold money and they have more goods to hold this money. This is the way how the gold standard worked. Look at the 19th century. There was a massive economic growth in the second half of the 19th century under the gold standard, and that was deflationary. Because simply the amount of goods have increased much faster than the amount of gold available. So the price of gold went up relative to the price of goods, which is inflation. But this is nice and interesting, but no country has gold standard today. No country has fixed money supply, so that's not that policy relevant. The more interesting case is when you have elastic money supply. And I think this is what we were really interested in this case. And the solutions in steady state are very similar. In the steady state, it doesn't matter what is your system, it doesn't matter what is the exact price level. Everything matters during the time of demographic transition when you shock the system, you provide some new guys, throwing some new guys to the system. And this is where I have to skip the solution of the model. I can send you the paper or you can download the paper online. The trick is that once you show the system goes out of equilibrium and you have a system of difference equations that you solve, which is easier. But the trick for the solution, and this is the important part, that the Marshallian K will increase with the baby boom. The people want proportionally to have more money compared to output. when the baby boomers hit working age. And why is that? I can tell you the intuition. The reason is that as a baby boomer, you want a stable saving vehicle. And you know that house prices work against you. House prices can go up and down. Real value, money is stable. So when you know that there are lots of other baby boomers out there, the relative value of money is higher. So you increase your money holdings, and in the aging phase, you will decrease this money holding to get back to steady state. So this is the simplest possible transition path that one can imagine. All right, so now this is the question here is that this sounds simple, but is it true? And once again, we look at the 22 usual suspect advanced economies for which we have program data. The time frame is a little bit longer. It's between 1950 and 2010. Here, there are some tricks that we have to do. So that's a problem with empirical analysis. One problem is the euro. You had 15 European countries with individual money supply. Great, you've got the statistics, you can download it. What do you do when you have the euro? And these euro area countries still maintain national M2 accounts, but you have to get there. It's not such a straightforward trick to do it. So you have to distribute the euro area M2 into 15 other countries. And these are the Marshallian case in the euro area and in other advanced economies, normalized to 1990 as 100. And what I would like to show you, this Marshallian case, once again, M2 over nominal GDP. So how much money you have compared to GDP. And you see that the trends vary quite a bit. For some countries it goes down, for some countries it goes up, with all kinds of trends. You have a fairly big trend for Korea, which is basically almost all up. The fact again here, the good thing is that you have lots of variation in the data. This is something that you can exploit and you can use. And this is what we are trying to do. So we run again a log panel regression. Our interest in this working age population. This is when the baby boomer enters and in the next phase and the next smaller generation enters. And this alpha coefficient is very significant. It's significant at 1% level statistically. And roughly it means that a 1 percentage point increase in the working age population is associated with a 1 percentage point increase in the Marshallian K, the ratio of money over GDP. Now, if you have one question about this regression, the question should be that why should we care? Because this R-squared is very low. Like you have a process which varies an awful lot. This is Marshallian K. You have demography which is very slow moving and doesn't jump an awful lot. So year on year, demography explains a minuscule portion of the change in the Marshallian K. And that would be a good question. This is economically significant. This is just, okay, statistically significant, but why should we care about all this aging-related money demand effect? And I will get back to that one. I can't touch based on this one, but this should be a concern of you. But first, let me just show you how robust these results are. So what we can try is we can put in time fixed effect, time and country fixed effects, and the result is there. It's not necessarily unit elasticity. It can go slightly down, 30% can get lost, but it's still quite big. And there's another set of robustness results. We say that you can restrict the time period in various ways. You can get rid of in M2 the first 10 years when data is very big. In the 1950s is also post-war reconstruction in many European countries and in Japan. probably that's not something unique can go on there that has nothing to do with long-term economic development. The effect is still there. You can constrain the estimation after the breakup of the Bretton Woods system. But you might say that between 1973, the global monetary system was very different than after 1973. This doesn't seem to affect much the result. You can focus on the first 30 years or last 30 years at the same time. And you see all these variations in the data. Basically, none of the time restrictions make the statistically significant result go away. What you see is something fairly robust in the data, that according to the standard theory of the quantity theory of money, it shouldn't be there. So what we find is that there is something there which is a very small year-on-year impact, but it's very significant in the data. All right, I'm not going through this one. This is just the idea that you can control for the interest rate, inflation rate, or the change in the interest rate, or the change in the inflation rate, or stock prices, or property prices in the data. So this means that let's throw in everything that the quantitative theory of money says should be there. Does it affect the estimate of alpha? This is the impact of the working age population on the Marshallian curve. And the response is no. What we have, we try to kill this alpha, we can't really kill it. And you remember we had this very steep increase for Korea in terms of Marshallian curve. I ran all these regressions without Korea. The effect is still there. It's slightly smaller, but it's still there, it's still significant. So from a statistical perspective, I would say that we have something. The real question is that do we have